Our first guest has a fearsome reputation in online marketing, where people like me fumble awkwardly with my computer. He wields the tools of the internet like weapons, slicing, bludgeoning, delicately crafting, polishing, arranging. And as he does this, he helps create the future we will live in. The wife of Steve Jobs recently searched him out for an important US-wide social marketing initiative. Lululemon is an important client. He has seen much success and much failure in himself and others, but it is the failure that interests him the most. Please welcome Jonathan Becker.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you all so much for having me here tonight. Over the past few years, I've read quite a bit about different people and the businesses that they've started. And in doing so and learning about the ups and downs that a lot of them have faced, there's one almost recurring theme that's really begun to fascinate me, and this is the concept of failure. Failure has a PR problem. There's a stigma in our culture around failure that causes most people to experience their failures in a fairly negative way. People try and sweep failures under the rug. They avoid failure at all costs. There's even a common expression that failure is not an option. In general, I find that people are embarrassed and ashamed of their failures, and this is not a particularly powerful way of being. So what I'd like to explore a little bit this evening is an alternative perception of failure, namely that failure is actually a natural, normal, and inevitable part of our lives that can be a profound catalyst for positive change. So the first thing that I'd like you to consider is that failure is not unique to you and I. It actually occurs to all different people at all different levels of society. So in fact, almost ironically, there are people in our culture who have been celebritized for their success, yet they themselves have dealt with their own fair share of failure. So let's take a look at a couple of these people. So the first is Steve Jobs. We know Steve Jobs as the billionaire mastermind behind Apple Computer, but he wasn't without his fair share of failure at the early points in his career. Particularly in the early 1980s, Steve Jobs and Apple launched a myriad of different products that were innovative but not particularly commercially successful. And this actually, as many of you know, resulted in Steve Jobs in 1985 being fired from Apple altogether over disagreements that he was having with Apple's leadership over the direction that the company should head in. I wish I could say that I had more in common with this guy, but interestingly, the only thing that we really do share in common is that we both had pretty severe learning disabilities growing up. In Einstein's case, he wasn't able to speak until the age of 4, and he couldn't read until the age of 7. So this obviously being the same person who went on to bring us the theory of relativity, for which he was awarded a Nobel Prize. Kevin Systrom in 2010 founded a company called Bourbon. He basically burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment capital before realizing that Bourbon wasn't really going to go anywhere. So he pivoted and took the same group of people that he'd been working with and started on a new venture. They named it Instagram, and only about 18 months after having quit Bourbon and started Instagram, again, as many of you may know, they sold it to Facebook for $1 billion. So not too bad for a guy who basically failed at one of his first attempts at business. Now, all of these people are known for their success, yet they've all clearly dealt with their fair share of failure. And what I take from this is that there's actually no inherent meaning in failure. In other words, just because you failed doesn't mean that you're a failure, and just because you failed doesn't mean that you won't be successful later on in life. The problem is that many people seem to get caught up in that stigma that I mentioned that I think exists around failure, and this causes them to experience their failures in a negative way. Now, luckily, I think this is just an issue of perception. So this is an aggregate performance graph of the New York Stock Exchange and Dow Jones Industrial Average throughout the 1990s. And luckily for you, I'm not here to give you any stock advice tonight, so why am I showing you this graph? And the answer is basically that I like the shape of this graph. If you look at it closely, blurry as it is right now, you can see that it goes up and down, but generally it does so on an upward trend. Now, the reason why I like the shape of this graph is because, to me, this is analogous with what people's lives are like. People's lives go up and down. They have good days and bad days, and they even have entirely good years and bad years. But generally speaking, as time goes on, things get better for people and their lives improve. Now, if this graph truly does serve as an illustration of what people's lives are like, there's two more things we can take from it. The first is that it appears that failure and success are inextricably linked with one another. In other words, it's almost impossible to experience one without at some point having experienced the other. The second is that it appears that failure is an inevitable part of our lives. So it's not if you will fail, but likely when you will fail. And that sounds kind of strange, but it actually opens up a brand new possibility in terms of the way we perceive failure. And with that, I'd like to propose a new way of looking at failure, and that is that failure is in fact an option. So now I'm not suggesting that people set out to fail, but what I am saying is that people embrace their failures for what they are, which are positive opportunities for growth and change in their lives. I'm not the only one who thinks this way, so let's take a look at what some other people have had to say about the same thing. So Conan O'Brien, after having been fired from NBC, reflected and said, "It's not easy, but if you accept your misfortune and handle it right, your perceived failure can become a catalyst for profound reinvention." Michael Jordan said, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. On 26 occasions, I've been entrusted to take the game-winning shot, and I missed. I have failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." And then finally, from Batman, because we can all totally learn life lessons from Batman, the character of Alfred said to young Bruce Wayne, "Why do we fall?" And of course, the answer is so that we can learn to pick ourselves back up. Now, I wish that I had a formula that everybody could take and figure out how to turn failures in their life into growth and change. But unfortunately, that's up to all of us individually. But what I would like to do is leave you with a few final thoughts that may help you see failure in a different light. The first of these is that the only constant in life is change. So if you're not happy with the way your life is right now, you can count on one thing, and that it will continue to change. It might get worse before it gets better, but it will, in fact, keep changing. Knowing that life is constantly changing brings us to the next point, which is that the only thing we know about the future is that it therefore will be different. This is powerful because we can stop focusing on what went wrong and start thinking about how we can change and make a better future. And then finally, don't ever give up. Don't ever let failure be a reason to stop you, because if failure was a reason to stop and not to do things, we would have never have developed the theory of relativity, the personal computer, cool apps like Instagram, and I certainly would not be standing on stage tonight talking to you about failing. Thank you very much.